Welcome to the smoke pit. In the military, the smoke pit is simply any odd place that service members will gather to have a smoke, a drink with their buddies, or just hang around to swap stories. And sometimes these stories are about experiences that the individual sharing doesn't really expect anyone to believe, possibly because even they themselves have a hard time believing it or making sense of it, or otherwise because, well, nobody likes to be laughed at or thought to be crazy. But since they feel the need to get it off their chest, the smoke pit is where these kinds of stories often circulate. In this episode, we are going to cover a number of encounters and other ghostly stories as told by the men and women who experienced them, some of them being service members, others being from their spouses. As I've noticed from my reading of many similar types of ghostly stories, one of the most common themes with regard to haunted buildings and other places is that these often seem to be places where something terrible happened, an unnatural taking of life, whether by the person's own hand or by murder. As such, if you are sensitive to that kind of thing, be aware that some of these stories may be difficult to listen to, especially as one of the final accounts is believed to be connected to the tragic murder of 2 young children. These are stories of hauntings where, with no one else to turn to, these men and women had to call the base chaplain. The Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, more commonly known as 29 Palms, sometimes called 29 Sticks, is often cited by Marines as being just about the worst duty station you could ever be stationed at. Not only is it very isolated, but it is in the middle of the Southern California desert, and therefore the weather is as miserably hot as you can imagine. If only to make things worse, 29 Palms has produced no small amount of reports from Marines and others regarding ghosts, unidentified creatures, and other terrifying stories from the base itself and the endless desert wasteland it occupies. This first story is from a Marine Corps spouse who found herself living in base housing and would quickly discover that the house she and her family had just been assigned to has something of a morbid history. Back in 1996, my husband was stationed at 29 Palms with 3rd Tanks. We were now moving into the old Marine Palms, one of the housing areas on the base. This strange occurrence happened 3 weeks after we had just moved into our new house with our 2 sons and my 2 young nieces, and I was pregnant with our 3rd child. It was around 3 a.m., and I woke up to use the bathroom. And while I was in there, I heard a man's voice tell me to get out.
Get out.
It was very clear.
Get out.
Again, I heard the voice say something, and this time it sounded much more aggressive. And so I immediately went to the bedroom where my husband was staying with the 2 boys, telling him to quit scaring me. But he was fast asleep. I assumed I had just been imagining things, being tired and all, so I went back to bed. But about 15 minutes later, with my nieces lying next to the side of my bed, one of the girls suddenly screamed, and she was saying that her hair was moving. I looked down, and her pigtail was floating up in the air. I didn't really think about it. I just grabbed the girls and I ran to my neighbor's house across the street. After calming down, I suppose I figured the boys would be okay staying with their dad, but I guess I panicked, and I later just thought that if I tried going back and waking my husband up to tell him what had happened, he probably wouldn't believe me. But then later that evening, my neighbor woke me up, and what she wanted to show me was that the lights were now flickering on and off in our house. So the next day, after my husband went to work, I went and told the base chaplain about what was happening, and he came and blessed the house. I felt kind of foolish, but a week later, the chaplain called me to tell me he had found out through research that a soldier who had returned home from Vietnam 20 years earlier, he had murdered himself in that house. Joint Base Lewis McChord. Are you a soldier who loves being cold and wet? Do you hate the sun? Are you perhaps a vampire? If so, you will love Joint Base Lewis McChord. Previously called Fort Lewis before it merged with the McChord Air Force Base in 2010, the northern section of the base, now called JBLM North, became a hub for activity in the 1940s, when the fort was a training and transition point for soldiers serving in World War II. In the early 2000s, after 50 years of insufficient funding and other setbacks, the base finally started to demolish many of the older World War II-era buildings and barracks to make way for new construction. Despite the overhaul of the base's infrastructure, some of the older, more iconic buildings had survived being torn down. And over the previous decades, these buildings had avoided demolition by being remodeled and repurposed many times over. A former Army officer, Jefferson Davis, who had served on the base and developed an interest in the paranormal, he explained in his 2005 book, Ghosts, Critters, and Sacred Places, that there is one building on the base that has garnered more ghostly attention than most, and that is the building now known as the JBLM Army Museum, which is one of, if not the oldest building on the installation. Originally a massive recreation facility for soldiers called Green Park that was built over a century ago, just after World War I, when the base was still called Camp Lewis. Over the years, the building was repurposed several times. In 1919, it began as a popular rec center filled with concession stands, theaters, eating places, a skee-ball arcade, shooting gallery, barbershop, a hotel, all of which the base commander, who it was named after, Major General Greene, had built in hopes of keeping his soldiers away from the more unscrupulous, what he called dens of vice that had sprung up just outside of the base. However, after a short period of success, the building quickly became unused after the war's end, and the majority of soldiers started leaving active service. By 1938, much of the now unused building had been torn down, and all that was left was the hotel. Before that happened, though, Green Park had once served to house the extras and film crew workers during the production of a 1927 patriotic silent film called The Patent Leather Kid. And that's where things started to get weird. With the film crew and cast staying in the Green Park building and the attached 150-room hotel, which was called the Red Shield Inn, the story goes that a worker on the film was murdered in a room on the second floor during production. And later, maids and hotel staff would swear they had seen the ghost of a man dressed as a cowboy wandering the halls. He always seemed to be sad or angry, or so the story goes. Now, because it goes so far back, none of the available sources for this story can tell us when the hotel staff had these encounters, whether it was in the 1930s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, or so on. But considering the film was a World War I reenactment, and that most ghosts people report seeing appeared to be wearing clothing that pertains to what they were wearing when they died, it begs the question why these women described seeing a cowboy. I watched the entire film, and there wasn't a single cowboy anywhere in it. But perhaps the women who saw what they thought was a cowboy, particularly because of the hat he was wearing, we can perhaps reason that unfamiliar with older military uniforms, they were simply doing their best to describe something that does appear in the film: an American soldier wearing a World War I campaign hat, which has a similar shape to a cowboy hat. Whatever it was, others staying and working in the hotel over the following decades would continue to report strange sounds, malfunctioning alarms, and the feeling of a heavy, mysterious chill. The hotel was used as a guest house up until 1972 for soldiers and their families who were transitioning to and from the base. But by 1973, the new fire and safety protocols deemed the building to be uninhabitable because of the heavy amount of asbestos used in construction, and contractors then gutted it and converted it to the Fort Lewis Military Museum. According to an article published in the Post newspaper, then known as the Fort Lewis Ranger, in 1987, the hauntings continued even after the building stopped being a hotel. Eventually, this article says, things got so out of hand that 3 priests were enlisted to perform an exorcism. One of them stood in the weapons park and prayed before entering the building, Barbara Bauer, the museum director at the time, said in the original article. Then all 3 of them went up to the 2nd floor where the man had been killed and said prayers and performed rituals. Afterwards, they came down and told me what happened. They said the man's spirit appeared to them. He told them that he was angry at himself because he had done something to cause his own death. They told him he was forgiven and free to go. The story ends with the man fading away in the doorway, stopping for a moment to cry before disappearing entirely. However, whether this exorcism took place or not is up for speculation. Miles Grant, the museum director who was interviewed by Marissa Petrick of the Northwest Guardian in 2011, he did say that even then, strange sounds and equipment malfunctions continued to occur, and most often on the 2nd floor, where the supposed murder had happened. The Catholic Church evidently keeps diligent records of exorcisms, and the Seattle Archdiocese has no record that any of its priests ever carried out such a ritual. It is then possible that the event was carried out by Army chaplains and remained undocumented, perhaps being done informally to avoid unwanted publicity. But the museum's director otherwise could find no record of either the murder in the 1920s or the exorcism in the 1980s. Whatever the case, the hauntings clearly didn't stop. In 1999, 2 military policemen, a man named John and his desk sergeant, were working the night shift on Fort Lewis when they received a report that the burglar alarms at the museum were going off. So they raced over to stop the break-in. But they found the museum locked up tight with no signs of forced entry. Then returning to the MP station, again, the alarms went off. So they returned, and again they found nothing unusual at the museum. And this apparently continued to happen throughout the night. Hardly strange, and quite possibly something very practical like the result of mice chewing on the alarm system's wiring. But with the possibility of an intruder still on the table, a couple nights later, John was on shift again, and he and his partner were instructed to patrol the museum's perimeter to discourage any thieves from returning. But while passing one of the building's outer gates, John said that he suddenly felt a sense of heaviness and physical chills. His sergeant later told him he was not the first person to report something like that. Other MPs would report seeing the building's lights flickering on and off when they found the museum was empty, and none of the alarms had sounded to indicate an intruder had entered the building. Looking for a thrill after hearing about John's encounter, his girlfriend, June, who had relayed all of these accounts to Jefferson Davis for his book, she admits that maybe she had just mentally tricked herself into believing this, but she said she did experience something strange when she and John went back to the museum one night so that June could try to relive his paranormal experience. She said that after getting out of the car and approaching the same gate that John had walked by, she too started to feel an overwhelming sense of coldness and dread, which filled her to the point where she became terrified and immediately ran back to the car. And as the two started to drive off, June said she could have sworn that she saw the outline of a figure standing in the top window of the museum. Unless I am much mistaken, this haunting and these reports of strange things in the building have continued even until today. Yokota Air Base is a joint military installation in Japan, located on the western outskirts of Tokyo. I myself spent several days training on this base in 2012, and they put us up in a tower apartment building near the flight line, possibly one of the tower buildings mentioned in this story, for all I know. This was during the winter, and we had just finished a week of reconnaissance field training up at Camp Fuji, a Marine Corps base located about 40 miles to the west from Yokota, at the foot of the massive volcano that the base is named after. And after we finished training at Fuji, they shuttled us back down to Yokota to spend several days completing our various parachute jumps on the base, both during the day and night, and from both fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircrafts to qualify for our golden jump wings. And the whole operation really just went to hell because of the high winds, and some of the guys were pretty badly hurt. But little did I know, while sleeping several nights in that two-bedroom tower apartment, that the base is apparently rife with haunted buildings, and with horrible stories attached to some of these hauntings. The military is often both a career and a work environment that places a high amount of stress on not only the service member, but their spouses and children. This can become overwhelming, and although the military's combined efforts to minimize this can fall short at times, and they are often criticized as being insufficient, the military as a whole, in my experience, does openly encourage their service members to always keep an eye on one another, to look out for warning signs of self-harm, and that anyone who is having these thoughts should immediately seek medical help and counseling. Still, the tragedy of a person ending their own life is sadly not an uncommon occurrence in the military, and no less so at the Yokota Air Base, even in recent years, let alone decades ago. This first account is just about as bad as it gets. Honey, I'm home. Honey? In the late 1970s, Air Force Tech Sergeant John Jarnebro returned home from work to his tower apartment and encountered one of the most horrible sights imaginable. The lifeless bodies of his 4-year-old son John and another little girl, 3-year-old Kimiko Russo, lay in the apartment, along with his 27-year-old wife, Lucy, whose wrists were slashed. The little girl, Kimiko, was the daughter of Staff Sergeant and Mrs. Russo, who lived in the same housing unit. It would seem that young Kimiko was spending the day being supervised by John's wife, Lucy. Despite her severe loss of blood after John called for help, Lucy was hospitalized, and the partial news article I found states that she was stabilized at the time. Whatever the causes for this incident, those who lived on Yokota Air Base at the time, whether service members or their families, they certainly remember hearing about the deaths of these two children when it happened. The news, of course, spread like wildfire around the base. Some recall hearing that the children had died from multiple knife wounds, but the news article indicates they had been drowned in the bathtub. In any available news records, I could find nothing about the events that followed, the court hearings, or anything that would clarify Lucy's motives. But those who recalled the event and discussed it in online forums, those who lived on the base at the time, they have additionally stated that they remember that not only were the children's deaths intentional, but that Lucy claimed she had been possessed and that she didn't remember anything that took place. Combined with other tragic events that have taken place in these tower apartments, predominantly people throwing themselves off of the building or the balconies, these events are often considered the reason for the many apparitions and other ghostly encounters in the buildings themselves and around the base. Although there are too many stories to include in this episode, and they will be covered in future, many of these encounters describe dark figures, shadowy shapes or silhouettes of a person, or perhaps even a child, described by residents of the buildings, whether in their apartments or perhaps in the elevators, the hearing of voices, sometimes calling for help, or knocking noises heard by children as they're sleeping, who then wake up and see an apparition standing near the bathroom. One tower is said to possibly be haunted by a teenage boy who jumped off of the building in the 1980s. It is said that the rooftops were then secured to prevent anyone else from accessing them. But residents have said they sometimes hear what sounds like a young man's voice, yelling, but they cannot see who or what is making the sound. The following is a separate account from a woman named Alicia, the spouse of an airman stationed in Japan at the time her story takes place. She was interviewed in 2021 by Erica Earle of the Stars and Stripes military newspaper. She says that, "My husband and I PCSed to Yokota Air Base in 2012 and moved into a house on base, a garden unit on the west side. Immediately, we started noticing strange things happening. Sometimes the bed in the spare bedroom would be inexplicably stripped of its sheets and blankets, or there would be a loud crashing sound in the kitchen in the middle of the night, but the kitchen was empty and there was nothing broken or misplaced. Sometimes we'd wake up in the morning to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open when they were shut the night before. At first, I just brushed it off, figuring my then husband might be the one doing all of it, but when he was deployed, and I was then left with no one else in the house to blame for what was going on, that's when I realized it couldn't have been him. I worried people might think I was crazy, but I started asking other service members and spouses about it to see if anyone else had similar experiences in their homes, and sure enough, a bunch of people have shared stories like mine. After hearing about these shared experiences, Alicia started a community on the base, which has continued until today as a private Facebook group for Yokota residents called the Yokota Ghost Hunter Club. Before this interview with Alicia the previous year in October of 2020, Erica Earle also interviewed Staff Sergeant Brianna Adams of the 374th Civil Engineer Squadron about her experiences with strange happenings on the base. She explained that she and her husband often heard clear, persistent knocking noises in their old East Side Tower unit. Security camera footage apparently showed televisions and bedroom lights turning on and off when no one was home. In the follow-up interview on the story in March of the following year, Erica also spoke with Chaplain Lance Brown, an Air Force captain assigned to Yokota's 374th Wing Staff Agency, as well as his wife, Karen Brown. Chaplain Brown and his wife have evidently been performing home cleanses or anointings for nearly a decade in homes on the base where odd things occur. Chaplain Brown stated that the cleansings are sometimes more about helping someone cope with anxiety, heartbreak, or a troubled past than about literal evil spirits. But of course, he said, I wouldn't suggest that the presence of spirits is all in the person's head. Whether we all believe in them or not, ghosts or demonic activity, these things of an evil or spiritual nature, only God can combat that, he said. As home cleanses are not officially sanctioned by the Air Force, we otherwise have the ability to be that beacon of hope as people invite us into their homes to deal with whatever has been troubling them. In March of 2021, Lori Pope, who also lived in one of Yokota's garden units, said she too started to feel uncomfortable in her home the previous year. My 3-year-old daughter has been experiencing sleep regression the past year, she explained. There have been several times when I would be watching her video monitor and I would see orbs of light in her room. And there have been a few instances where I'd be in my bedroom and I would see a white streak of light run past the foot of my bed. And more recently, my daughter has been saying she's seeing monsters and that she's scared. Lori and her husband, Master Sergeant Austin Pope of the 374th Maintenance Squadron, decided that since Lori was 6 months pregnant at the time, they needed to do something to help their daughter feel less afraid and sleep through the night before bringing a new baby home. The family happened to meet Chaplain Brown and his wife, and despite not identifying with any religion, they decided to invite the Browns over to give the house cleansing a try. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm hoping we can all learn to live more comfortably in our home regardless of whether there is a spirit existing here, Lori said. The Popes, who had their home cleansed on March 1st, 2021, were hopeful that the process seemed to have helped. "My daughter still isn't sleeping through the night," Lori later said, "but I do feel a much greater sense of peace being home alone, especially at night." The Browns do the cleanses free of cost, judgment, or disclosure, they said. People need not be religious to have a home cleansing, and the Browns said their objective is not to convert anyone's belief systems. During the same interview, the couple said that they received more calls at Yokota over the past year than they did in the entirety of their previous assignment in Fort McConnell Air Force Base, Kansas. The Browns weren't certain exactly how many calls they have received on Yokota, but explained that they receive a steady flow of requests and even had a cleansing arranged for right after their interview with Stars and Stripes. The Browns declined to share the details of specific cleansings, but said that they have both experienced fear and emotional responses themselves during some of the visits. "It's not anything of Hollywood, but evil is a very real thing," Chaplain Brown said. "You just sense an absolute darkness, and your skin tingles, and the hair on the back of your neck raises, and you get a sense of, I don't want to be here." I'm not certain if Chaplain Brown has been reassigned since this interview took place, but in any case, Yokota Air Base, and certainly many more bases throughout Japan and the rest of the world, continue to be no stranger to hauntings.